A black woman driving like that, in this neighborhood at this hour? Honestly, that's suspicious. A white police officer shot an unarmed black woman and thought he would get away with it. But he didn't know the person he had just shot was a federal agent on an undercover mission. He thought she was just a stubborn girl until the entire justice system turned around and came for him. This story makes no room for tears and even less for forgiveness. And if you think you already know how it ends, then you've just gotten everything wrong. Watch until the very last second, or you'll never know how that cop fell. The reason for the stop wasn't a traffic violation. Morning hadn't fully arrived yet, and a thin veil of mist still hovered over the rows of trees lining the sidewalk when a siren blared from behind, slicing through the air like a blade. Kenya Mallory glanced into her rear-view mirror, patrol lights flashing on the rooftop and reflecting off the windshield ahead. She immediately signaled, slowed down, and pulled to the curb. There was no panic, only precise movements honed from every previous time she had been pulled over, an experience every black person knew by heart, even when there was never a valid reason. The dark blue patrol car braked sharply at the edge of the road, its headlights still glaring, washing out Kenya's left mirror. She remained seated behind the wheel, one hand resting on it while the other reached calmly for the leather wallet containing her documents on the passenger seat. The habit, trained over dozens of past encounters with street cops, made each move slow and deliberate to avoid any misunderstanding. She had nothing to hide, but she knew, in this place, simply existing could be an excuse. A car door flung open with a screech, metal grinding against pavement. Brad Cutler stepped out, heavily, his boots striking the asphalt in steady thuds. Kenya saw him the moment he exited and knew not to speak too much, not out of fear, but because she had met his type before. Tall, neatly uniformed, hand near the belt, chin jutting forward as if he alone set the terms of the atmosphere around them. Brad said nothing as he approached the window. He scanned the car's interior with calculated eyes, from the dashboard to the bag on the seat. Then his gaze landed on the driver. Kenya rolled the window down, holding a polite smile that was just civil enough not to be accused of defiance, but never submissive. "This car doesn't look like it's yours," he said, voice low and even, laced with a kind of contempt that didn't need her answer. It wasn't a question. It was a verdict. A preemptive strike Kenya had heard in many forms before, differing only in tone and face. She glanced at the registration placed clearly on her lap, then looked him in the eye. "My documents are right here. This car's registered in my name." Brad took them, barely looking, eyes still fixed on her face, as if searching for proof of his bias. He gave a small nod, but it was not agreement. He looked back at the sedan, lingering longer this time, then spoke again, words tight and deliberate. "A black woman driving like this in this neighborhood at this hour? That's suspicious." Kenya's grip on the wheel tightened slightly, yet she remained still. The words were not new, but each time they landed with the dull punch of a clenched heart. She didn't respond. She knew this was not the time for words. In moments like this, the only thing that preserved life was silence and standing tall. Brad stepped back half a pace, not speaking further. Kenya recognized the look. He wasn't finished, just choosing his next opening to prod and corner her. But she didn't flinch. She had stood her ground her entire life under gazes like his. Today would be no exception. Kenya opened the car door and stepped out, posture upright and composed. The morning light had begun to gold tint the horizon, shining through drooping leaves and casting the street in the hue of an unfinished photograph. Her pressed orange blazer hugged her shoulders with calm confidence. The kind formed through trials survived without need for explanation. She didn't scan her surroundings or rush forward. She simply stood in the middle of the sidewalk's shadowed patch, eyes steady on the officer, now squinting at her like he was assessing whether she might be a problem worth escalating. "I wasn't speeding. Why did you stop me?" Kenya's voice was clear, not loud, but enough to push back the absurd pressure thickening between them. Brad Cutler squinted, eyes locked on her shoulder movement, drifting to the bag on the front seat. He didn't answer immediately. His right hand tapped the holster at his side, an unhidden warning. Then he stepped in, shrinking the distance until only breath separated them. You don't need to know. He paused for a moment, then forced out each word through clenched teeth. I ask, you answer. Kenya kept her gaze steady, the glint from the side mirror behind her reflecting not her body but a pride that refused to be broken. Brad's response didn't surprise her, nor did it make her step back. In a city where every action could be twisted by bias, she was far too used to people not needing a reason to begin something dangerous. Brad glanced down at her feet, then back up, his breathing beginning to quicken. He repeated himself, slower this time, almost grinding his jaw. I'm the one asking. You just follow. He emphasized the word you as if it were not a pronoun but a reminder of where Kenya stood in his imagination. Lower, weaker, more controllable. The air seemed to slow. A nearby door cracked open, then shut quickly when someone inside realized this situation wasn't one to guess at. Something was off. Something heavy settling in, turning a quiet sidewalk into a place thick with pressure, as if about to split open from an irreversible act. Kenya shifted a step to the right, just enough to avoid being boxed in, but not enough to escalate the tension. The movement wasn't resistance, it was control. She didn't argue, didn't reply to his crude words. Her silence, instead of calming Brad, made him feel his authority was being challenged. He said nothing more, just stood there, hand on his holster, shoulders raised slightly, eyes fixed on her left wrist, where nothing sat but a faint glint of light bouncing off her watch. In his mind, the once simple situation had turned into something that no longer fit the mold he usually imposed. This woman didn't step back, didn't argue, and wasn't afraid. He was facing a kind of person he didn't know how to manage, and that discomfort quickly turned into irritation, then into something murky and close to hatred. On the road, cars began diverting when they noticed a police presence at the curb. A child on a bicycle slowed as he passed by, then sped up, as if sensing something heavier than what his eyes could grasp. Brad glanced toward the bike the boy had just ridden away on, then turned back, no longer pretending to be civil. Kenya saw in his eyes not a flash of momentary anger. It was the look of someone who felt his control slipping, and who was now searching for any way, no matter the cost, to reclaim it. The interrogation began right on the sidewalk. Brad flipped through the documents in his hand, as if waiting for a typo or an invalid number to leap off the page. His eyes paused on the full name, then slid over to the ID photo, the eyes in the picture matching exactly the person standing before him, calm, unwavering. He glanced up at Kenya, then lowered his voice as if inspecting her rather than conducting a routine check. What's your job? Where? Who do you live with? His tone was hard as stone, devoid of conversational rhythm, more like a series of chisels, each jab meant to expose something he was convinced she was hiding. Kenya kept her gaze on his face, not confrontational, but she made no effort to dial back the composure that had irritated him from the start. She knew exactly where this kind of exchange could go if she didn't hold the wheel tight with verbal restraint. I'm heading to the office, she enunciated each word, not breaking eye contact, and I have no obligation to answer unless you provide a specific reason for this interrogation. Her reply wasn't angry, but it was as cold and firm as folded steel. Just enough to establish a boundary Brad wasn't used to seeing drawn in front of him. He squinted, a flat smile tugging briefly at the corner of his mouth like a reflex in someone accustomed to women backing down or complying after a few soft threats. But this time, he realized the resistance wasn't flesh, it was willpower. Brad stared at Kenya for a few more seconds, as if searching for a crack in her voice, some weak spot to slip through, but all he found was a woman who hadn't once faltered in tone. That self-control didn't earn his respect, it sparked his anger. Anger because it had no reason to exist here, on this street, under his gaze, in a situation where she should have felt at least a notch lower. He took a light breath, then started circling to the passenger side, eyes scanning the car's interior from that angle. Going to the office? Which one? What's so urgent at this hour? The questions came quickly, seemingly harmless, but Kenya didn't move, nor did she reply. Her silence now lacked any hint of caution. It was a deliberate stand. He asked, but she no longer played by his rules. One of Brad's hands gripped the documents tightly, The other reached for the radio clipped to his chest, but instead of speaking into it, he quietly pushed it back into place. He was hesitating, or perhaps calculating, whether pushing this further into a deadlock would get him anything worthwhile. Kenya knew he was looking for a shortcut. This was no longer an inspection, it had become a power test. Every question aimed not at verifying paperwork, but at piercing the defense between them, forcing her to bow or react, so he could trap her as combative. But she didn't withdraw inward or rise in fury. She stood like a cliff that had long faced waves, not expecting calm, but not collapsing either. Brad jerked his chin toward the trunk and spoke slowly, this time like an order. Open the trunk. Kenya didn't move. A command issued with no reason, no evidence of wrongdoing, and absolutely no authority backing it without a warrant, or at least a lawful claim of threat. She didn't comply, and that silence dropped like acid on the arrogance in his eyes. Brad smirked, but his jaw clenched, and he stepped half a beat closer. The space wasn't wide, but the air between them now held a line he knew crossing would leave no way back. Yet Brad Cutler had never been the kind of man who stopped at lines. Brad tilted his head, eyes narrowing as if he had just stumbled upon a curious form of entertainment during a sluggish morning. His face stretched into a crooked smile, devoid of any warmth. That tone? Used to giving orders, huh? He tossed the question like a pebble into still water, but the surface didn't ripple. Kenya stood firm, her gaze steady, lips pressed slightly, her expression shifting from calm to something colder, no longer composed, but shaped by years of operating in an environment where every word could be twisted and misinterpreted. She didn't need to reply, because the question wasn't worth answering. To her, it was nothing more than a trap constructed from bias and a thirst for control. But that silence made Brad itch. He wasn't used to being left hanging, especially when he had initiated the game. His tone suddenly changed, dry as a whetstone, stripping away any pretense of dialogue. I'm not asking any more. Turn around, hands behind your head, now. The command came without justification, without the slightest warning. The tone made it clear this wasn't a request, it was an order, and disobedience would instantly be reframed as defiance. Kenya locked eyes with him, unblinking. There was no buffer between them now. The situation had exited the gray zone and crossed into coercion, a space where power was wielded like a baton and commands landed like strikes across dignity. The air between them thickened. The early morning light seemed to dim, as if the entire block paused to witness the peak tension of a play with no wasted lines. A nearby door cracked open again, then slammed shut when its occupant caught sight of the uniform. Above, a doorbell camera silently adjusted its angle. On the pavement, Kenya still hadn't turned. She wasn't dodging, but neither was she conforming to the script. She stood motionless, like a stone casting shadow under a warning long foretold. Brad stepped back, not out of caution, but to make space for his dominant hand to reach the gun more easily. He was waiting for her to react. Anything. A question, a twitch, a glance out of rhythm. He didn't need an official reason. He needed something he could extract from the camera angle, from the post-incident report, from the keystroke that recorded a suspect's failure to comply with a clear command. But Kenya didn't play into his expectations. She didn't resist, nor did she submit. She said just one sentence, enough to erase the line between authority and intimidation. I won't turn around unless you give me a lawful reason. The words weren't loud, not sharp, but landed in his ears like the free fall of authority, ripped from his grasp. Brad said nothing. His right hand edged toward his belt, index finger brushing the retention strap of the holster. A ray of sunlight cut through the rearview mirror, casting a sliver of light across his cheek, highlighting a tense vein near his temple. Everything held still for a moment, then shifted into a kind of chaos that had no name. A car turned onto the street from a distance, slowed, then reversed abruptly after the driver glanced their way. Brad didn't care. In his eyes, no one else existed now except the woman refusing to yield, and the only thing left in his mind was how to turn that defiance into an excuse to act, not for safety, not for the law, just because he hated the feeling of someone standing upright in front of him without asking permission. Kenya held her position, not moving, not stepping back, not lowering her gaze. Her voice came out clear, not loud, but weighted, striking the tense air between them like a firm knock. "What am I being arrested for?" There was no trace of pleading or resistance in her question, and certainly no deference one might expect when standing before someone holding a gun. She did not ask for mercy, nor did she try to prove her innocence. She only wanted to know, at the very moment his power pressed down on her neck like a boot, what excuse he would use. Brad did not need any time to think. He growled his answer as if he had been waiting for that question just to deliver the most cutting reply possible. "For being out of line, for standing like you're in charge, even though you're nobody." As soon as he finished, the space between them became like glass struck hard, not shattered, but fractured. Kenya looked at him as if seeing a conclusion she had known for a long time. No need for further proof. Brad's anger began to surface, the blood rushing up to his hairline. He tilted his head left, as if weighing whether to keep up the verbal abuse or to shift to the kind of language he used when words failed to intimidate. His right hand clenched, knuckles whitening, while his left hovered near his belt. Kenya did not blink. She did not retreat or show defiance, just kept her gaze locked like a mirror, reflecting back the image of someone trying to impose a threat as justification for what was about to happen. A faint noise came from the yard across the street, a curtain shifting, then stilled. Kenya knew someone was watching, from above or from a camera fixed under the eaves, but that didn't bring any reassurance. If evidence always spoke for itself, then people like her would never have to learn to stand still through pain or bleed just to explain wounds they never caused. Brad leaned in, closing half the distance, his breath practically touching her face. "Who do you think you are? Giving me orders?" he hissed, no longer playing the cop, but now an open adversary. His ego, having been challenged, could not let this woman keep talking in that calm tone. He wanted to see her bow, or get angry, or at least flinch in discomfort, anything that would confirm he still had control. Kenya still did not respond. Her silence was not fear, but an understanding of exactly where this was headed if she made one misstep. Behind Brad, a gray sedan rolled by, slowing, the driver lowering a window, glancing at the scene before speeding off, leaving the low rumble of an engine in the thick air. Everything in that frame seemed to be holding its breath for a sudden moment, an incident that would later be clipped from footage, played on newsreels, and debated endlessly in comment sections with no one taking responsibility. Brad gritted his teeth, spitting out one last sentence as a final command. "For the last time, turn around." Kenya's breath slowed, the world behind her fading, leaving only the distorted, furious face of the man in front of her. She knew exactly where her hands were, exactly how the light caught his eyes, and she knew if he acted in the next few seconds, there would be no questions anyone could claim were justified. Only the account written by the hand left holding the pen. He remained perfectly still, her body and voice seemingly anchored to the ground, bracing for something about to happen that nobody could stop anymore. On the third floor of the building across the street, a phone lifted from a shaded balcony, its lens quivering yet still capturing the unfolding scene below. The man behind the camera wanted only a brief clip of a vague altercation like those he had seen online, but the moment stretched far beyond his expectation. On the pavement, Brad Cutler stepped back, feet angled for balance, his right hand slicing toward his hip with the smooth rhythm of a drill practiced hundreds of times. His left arm crossed his chest, his right drew the pistol in one clean arc, and a single, sharp bang cracked through the morning air. The round entered Kenya's body from less than 2 paces away, delivered without warning or explanation. Her torso folded, left arm contracting, hand clamping the spot where blood already spread, then her whole frame toppled like a tree severed at the base. Ragged breaths mixed with wind rustling through the fence, and for a few suspended seconds the street seemed unable to comprehend what had happened. Brad stayed where he was, gun still in hand, shoulders taut, eyes on the woman now lying on the sidewalk as if a weight had been knocked from its orbit. He did not rush forward or step back. He hurled into the silence a coarse line, "I thought you were pulling something." His voice broke unevenly, the first half sounding like justification, the last half cracking like a shout trying to bury something primal. His gaze swept the balcony, the opposite curb, and the half-open car window a few houses down. He was not looking for help, he was hunting for cameras. The urgency in his eyes resembled a player replaying the opening seconds of a match already botched. Beside his boots, Kenya lay on her side, eyes half open, breathing labored, both hands pressing her lower abdomen to stem the flow. The orange blazer clung to her frame, the white blouse beneath darkening like soaked cloth, drops of blood tapping the asphalt in time with a pulse slowing bit by bit. From a distance came a dog's bark. Then the crash of metal dropped behind an unsecured door. Someone uttered something indecipherable, the voice cracking under strain. A woman in sleepwear ran out, froze at the sight, hand to her mouth, then retreated behind the gate she had just pushed open. The balcony cameraman kept filming, his hands shaking harder, yet the lens locked on every move. Brad slid the pistol back into its holster with mechanical care, as if arranging a new version of reality. He stepped half forward, then back, lifted the radio, and spoke in a dry monotone. Suspect injured, appeared to draw an unidentified object, requesting medical support on scene. The phrasing was already edited in his mind, ready for the first official report. Kenya tried to speak, but only rapid breaths passed between clenched teeth. Her shadow stretched across the pavement in the rising sun, merging with the spreading stain, a warped silhouette that no cleaning could erase. In that instant, none of the onlookers knew the woman on the ground was not a random victim, but the pivotal figure in a confrontation that, from this point on, could never be contained at the level of a mere warning. Brad pressed firmly on the radio, his voice bursting out like a second explosion striking the base of his throat. Steady, yet calculated. Subject is injured, potentially dangerous behavior, requesting emergency medical aid and security support. His words rang out sharp and decisive like a code he had rehearsed dozens of times, wrapped in the false calm that those accustomed to managing fallout often use to reassure themselves. He did not look at Kenya again, as though her lying there was the inevitable outcome of an action he had foreseen, even though nothing in the preceding events had posed any real threat. In Brad's mind at that moment, the most important thing was to set the story from the start. He had not attacked, he had reacted. The victim was not harmless. The victim was suspicious, and if anyone asked why, he would point to the reflection of metal on the wrist, to an instinctive reaction, to an unverifiable risk. A second police siren drew near from the opposite direction, gliding down the street and pulling up at the curb. Two young officers leapt from the vehicle without asking questions, merely observing Brad and then Kenya before beginning to cordon off the area according to procedure. One of them erected a small yellow plastic barrier around the sidewalk, while the other shouted, "Clear the scene, please do not gather. This area is not safe." His warning cut through the growing thud of footsteps from the houses lining both sides of the street. Residents began to cluster, some in flip-flops, others still in sleepwear, their faces etched with suspicion, fear, and anger. A middle-aged man raised his phone, filming while muttering, "I heard the gunshot. It was unmistakable." A woman pulled her small child back and spoke loudly enough for those nearby to hear. "She did nothing. I saw it from across the way. She was just standing there," yet they could not approach any closer. The two officers who had just arrived executed exactly what they had been trained to do: keep civilians at a distance where they could neither hear more, nor see clearly, nor record anything beyond what Brad permitted. One officer aimed a flashlight at the man recording and barked, "Lower the device. This is a crime scene." The atmosphere on the street turned viscous, every sound stifled by the presence of uniforms and the wall of law erected so swiftly that no one could mount a challenge. Brad glanced at the group behind the plastic barrier without a word, then turned back to Kenya lying on the ground. He dropped to one knee, not out of concern, but to follow the procedure for assessing the severity of her injuries. She was still breathing, short and shallow, her eyes half open, her lips moving in ragged intervals as if she wanted to speak, but her throat would not allow it. One of the young officers leaned in and asked quietly, "Does she have a weapon?" Brad did not answer immediately. He scanned the area around Kenya before shaking his head in what seemed like disappointment at not finding a clear justification. "I see nothing," but her hand moved quickly at that moment. Could have been a mistake. purely an instinctive reaction. His response was vague enough to avoid direct accusation while still paving the way for a favorable report. He looked down at Kenya's uniform, where a blood stain had soaked deep into the fabric, spreading into a dark-rimmed, blurred circle. She curled her legs slightly and held her abdomen, her eyes now clouded not from blood loss but from understanding more than anyone else. He had just fabricated a story in which she was the center, but would not be allowed to speak a single word. Behind, a child tugged softly at his mother's hand and whispered, "Mom, is she a bad person?" The woman didn't answer. She only shook her head and turned away with her child, as if she knew that any explanation now would be drowned out by the reports already shaped from the moment the gun left its holster. From the opposite direction, a middle-aged woman rushed into the street, her hoarse voice rising like a suppressed scream from deep within. "I saw everything. She stood still. He shot out of anger." Her words echoed through the tension-filled air, reaching everyone standing behind the temporary barriers. Her face twisted with indignation, her finger pointed directly at Brad, her eyes never leaving the blood pooling under Kenya's feet. Some people around her turned their heads, looking at her, then back at the scene, as if her words had helped them piece together what they had witnessed but were hesitant to articulate. Brad didn't react or turn around, but his eyes briefly flicked toward a young officer at the barricade, signaling with a slight nod, like an unspoken order. Immediately, two other officers stepped forward. They didn't ask the woman her name or what she'd seen. They simply said, "Leave this area immediately. This is a secured scene." Before the woman could reply, she was gently pushed back and escorted away from the crowd. Another bystander attempted to film with a phone but was quickly stopped by an officer in a bulletproof vest. "We need to check your phone. The footage is not authorized for dissemination yet." His voice carried a forced politeness wrapped in administrative language, as if they weren't confiscating a device, but rather assisting with information verification to prevent inaccuracies. Nearby, a young girl quickly slipped her phone into her pocket, avoiding the gaze of the closest officer. She knew the rules clearly. Nothing belonged to an individual if the incident involved the police. No one was allowed to record anything not already documented officially. Scattered protests fell into the air like rain hitting glass, audible but ineffective. One by one, people were moved further away from the central area as an ambulance slowly made its way down the street. Its flashing lights didn't ease the tension. Instead, they intensified the confined feeling, as if something was being deliberately hidden amidst the flickering red lights and silent figures. Brad stepped back to the patrol car, leaning against its door with his arms crossed, expressionless. He no longer acted proactively, but quietly observed how everything unfolded according to the familiar script. From his position, he watched each person being removed from the scene, each gaze being lowered, each video being ordered deleted immediately. An older officer passed by, nodding briefly at Brad before muttering something into his radio. The air was thick with hot plastic and dust, yet the heaviest thing wasn't the heat, it was the carefully orchestrated silence between the two sirens. Kenya was lifted onto a flexible stretcher, hand pressed tightly to her stomach, mouth slightly open as if attempting to say something but lacking the strength. Two paramedics held her head steady while another checked her pulse, shaking his head in concern. A white cloth was pressed against the wound, immediately staining red as if no further bullet was needed to finalize the truth. She was still conscious, her eyes fixed on the dispersing crowd, on the woman who had shouted earlier, and on the empty space between herself and Brad, where the irreversible had occurred. A whisper escaped her lips. Barely audible, but a paramedic leaned in quickly enough to hear. He stared at her for a few seconds before speaking into his headset. "She's trying to say something. Not clear, but it seems to be about identity." The stretcher was swiftly loaded into the ambulance, doors shutting behind it, leaving Brad standing on a street thinning out, yet still dense with stairs. But he wasn't shaken. He knew that as long as control was swiftly maintained, the truth could be rewritten at the speed of reporting. And at that moment, he still believed he was ahead. Noon that day, the first press release was dispatched to local news outlets. In the opening lines, The headline appeared in rigid clarity. A woman of color was shot while suspected of carrying a weapon. The wording was chosen as if the author were not describing a specific event, but merely adjusting a template to fit an annual statistical framework. There was no mention of the shooter's name, no identification of the victim, no reference to a precise location or any objective facts that might allow the audience to grasp the severity of the situation. Everything was compressed into a vague label and an evasive narrative. The most important sentence lay at the end of the paragraph. The incident is under internal review, and the officer involved has been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation. That meant Brad Cutler remained at liberty, able to leave headquarters, return home, even stroll the streets if he wished, because in bureaucratic language the term suspected is never as weighty as dangerous, and temporary is always used to defer what demands immediate accountability. In the local police station's break room, Brad sat clutching a still-hot cup of coffee, his gaze trained on the wall-mounted television where a news channel was airing the blurred footage recorded by bystanders. Nothing was clear. Every moment was obscured by the cameraman's hand and the glare of sunlight reflecting on the lens. On screen, the silhouette of a person in a vest collapsing onto the sidewalk appeared briefly, followed by a crowd being pushed back. The commentator spoke in a neutral tone. This video is circulating on social media, sparking controversy. The police have not issued a final statement. Brad leaned back in his chair, his shoulders relaxing, a faint smirk curling the corner of his mouth as if he were watching a game whose rules he understood better than anyone else viewing it. His personal phone buzzed with an internal message from his superiors. The content was simple and terse. Do not comment. Everything is being handled in proper order. Brad did not reply. He locked the screen, set the phone down on the table, and drew his badge from his wallet, flipping it between his fingers. To him, the incident was not a crisis but a challenge in a sequence of maneuvers he believed himself trained well enough to manage. In his mind, the event was not a consequence, but the opening phase of a media battle, and those who remained silent at the right moment would emerge as the last survivors. On social media, some users began sharing brief eyewitness accounts. A woman claimed to have seen the entire incident from a second-floor window and insisted the woman who was shot had made no threatening move. A longer video surfaced, its image blurry, but the screams of onlookers after the shot clear and piercing. Under the comments, public opinion split into two halves. One side was enraged by the evident injustice, the other invoked previous incidents to defend police action as a professional reflex. Brad's name had yet to appear in any post. He remained the officer involved, still shielded by a system accustomed to hiding everything behind the phrase internal review. At the county hospital, Kenya Mallory was placed under special observation in the post-operative unit. Her condition remained critical. 3 units of blood had been transfused, and the bullet had torn through her right abdominal tissue and affected her kidney. The treating physician offered no prognosis. In her medical record, under occupation, the nurse had written the exact line Kenya read aloud before losing consciousness. Federal agent. That entry had not been released. No one beyond her attending physician knew of it, and no one yet imagined that the entire story was about to turn on those 3 words. Words obscured by so many initial preconceptions. Gallagher's death, Susanna's rape, Ogden's pride. In the darkness of the second ambulance compartment, Kenya Mallory lay motionless, her entire body covered beneath a thin blanket soaked with blood, her face turned slightly aside with a breathing tube pressing against her cheekbone. She had been transferred in mid-afternoon without prior notice or announced route. The first hospital had registered her under a temporary designation, without a name, identification records, or family contact. Her medical record noted her condition as severe internal bleeding, impaired consciousness, weak reflexes. The 2 paramedics had instructions not to share any information, even with local police, unless explicitly directed from above. The ambulance quietly left the Frontline Medical Center, heading toward a regional hospital specializing in complex trauma. She was treated as an unidentified patient without a guardian or relatives. All her data was encrypted, inaccessible for retrieval. Outside, the sky darkened amid the oppressive afternoon heat. The sunlight stretched into thin, patchy streaks through scratched windows, resembling suppressed truths uncertain when they would resurface. On the highway, no one knew who was inside that vehicle, nor would anyone imagine that the woman who had just been shot was a crucial link capable of changing the entire system. At police headquarters, Brad Cutler had just concluded an internal review meeting with a unit inspector. He exited the room with his shirt half unbuttoned, a temporary leave card still clipped to his pocket, his eyes sharp, not tired, but calculating. He knew precisely how much distance to maintain from everything: the media, the victim, and even officers of equal rank. As he entered a quiet hallway, a commanding officer approached, neither saluting nor glancing around, speaking softly in a tone both warning and suggestive. "Resolve this quickly. Keep her name from leaking out." Brad paused for less than a second, his fingers briefly hesitating at his belt before dropping loosely. He immediately understood the implications. This woman wasn't random. Her records might not yet be opened, but her name had undoubtedly prompted someone at the top to slam their fist on the table. In his world, when a commanding officer refrained from directly naming the victim, merely referring to her as her, it signified she was far more significant than the press could imagine. And an order wasn't a promise. It was the dividing line between retention and expulsion from the machinery. Brad nodded slightly, continuing his walk. Another plan was already forming in his mind. No longer about managing the scene or filling gaps in reports, now it was about controlling information, shielding her identity and personal relationships, erasing all links to the truth. He needed to ensure nobody traced where Kenya worked, nobody accessed her official record. Every trace had to be erased before someone else touched it. And simultaneously, an internal call from a federal office was transferred to the police station's reception. The caller's voice was calm and steady, yet sufficient to make the officer on duty break into a sweat. "We need to verify the condition of a federal agent injured this morning. Information indicates she was in an area under your unit's jurisdiction." The desk officer immediately transferred the call higher, and at that exact moment, Brad stepped around a corner, feeling a chill run down his spine. He knew time was closing in, and this time the person being scrutinized would no longer be the victim. In the post-operative unit, silent as water held between two thick walls, a young nurse changed bandages while checking the inside pocket of Kenya Mallory's jacket, the fabric still dark where the blood had not fully dried. As she gently lifted the vest's inner hem, she suddenly spotted a corner of hard plastic protruding from a secret seam on the left chest. The small badge, only slightly larger than 2 fingertips, had a silver border with raised lettering and a crisp, embossed logo of 3 initials stamped in metal: FBI. She said nothing, her hand pausing for half a second before carefully folding the fabric back as if she had never touched it. A few minutes later, she left the room and walked straight to the administrative wing, where the interagency hotline phone stood, and without asking the head nurse for permission, she instinctively dialed the Washington Communications Center. She did not read out the patient's name or provide detailed medical information, speaking only briefly enough for the recipient to grasp the urgency. "A female patient was brought in from the western suburbs this morning. I discovered an official badge of the Federal Bureau of Investigation inside her clothing. She may be an agent. Identity is still unknown due to a lack of documents, but her condition is critical." There was a brief pause on the other end before a deep male voice asked for the room code, the hospital's name, and the location of her personal effects. Then came the concise closing line: "We will handle this." 20 minutes later, the hospital's legal department received a call from a non-public contact representing the Federal Security Office. In a 3-minute conversation, they were informed that the patient's admission number would place her under high-level security monitoring, and that all information must be immediately encrypted and isolated from public records. This meant that doctors, nurses, and administrative staff could no longer access her medical file through standard procedures. All requests for access had to be approved via a special channel coordinated by a supervisory team from Washington. In the hospital's server room, a technician immediately executed a command to lock the data stream, moving Kenya Mallory's records into internal archive mode. Her name no longer appeared in the quick search system, X-rays and vital signs were encrypted, and all treatment logs were moved into a hidden folder. The hospital had suddenly rendered Kenya invisible among the hundreds of patients sharing the same floor. But for those in the know, each action was not meant to protect her identity, but to preserve the structure of a system cracking under pressure during business hours. Late that afternoon, Kenya's first colleague called the hospital on an internal line, his tone calm to the point of coldness. He identified himself by code name, recited the verification code, and requested direct connection with the patient coordination supervisor. "We have just confirmed that Agent Mallory is being treated at your facility. Please verify her current status. All external reporting is to be suspended, treatment logs locked, and from this point forward, all medical directives will come from the federal office." The hospital coordinator complied immediately without asking why. Before the call ended, an unmarked black car pulled up to the emergency entrance, its windows dark. Two plainclothes men stepped out, flashed unmarked credentials, and demanded to be escorted to the inpatient ward where Kenya was located. They offered no explanation or further confirmation, standing silently outside the door and watching. Their arrival caused no disturbance, but made the entire shift realize that the incident had entered a new phase. From that moment on, every drop of IV fluid, every organ scan, every heartbeat of Kenya would be protected, as if it contained a code capable of burning down an entire executive structure if it fell into the wrong hand. Brad Cutler sat alone in his unmarked car, parked silently behind the police headquarters, the faint glow of a street lamp reflecting dimly off the windshield. The dashboard clock had just passed 8 o'clock when his phone rang. He glanced at the caller ID, recognized the internal code, and answered without hesitation. On the other end, a man's clipped voice broke the silence. "She's an agent from the FBI." Brad did not turn his head or blink. His lips pressed into a thin line before he rasped a single hoarse question. "Is she alive?" A few seconds of silence followed before the reply came. "Unknown. They're withholding medical data, and her records have been pulled from the system. The Washington office is involved." Brad said nothing further. He hung up, placed the phone on the passenger seat, and continued staring at the half-closed gate of the lot. His breathing slowed, then suddenly clenched into a rough sound. His head bowed and both hands gripped the steering wheel as if he could snap it in two. Those words had left him no escape. He understood perfectly that if she survived, everything he had staged would collapse before the report was ever printed. He did not leave the car immediately. He stayed seated for several more minutes, as if he hoped another call might come with better news, or at least an opening to avoid disaster. But nothing happened. Outside, the city continued its nocturnal clamor, while inside him a razor-sharp silence began to shred whatever remained of his composure. When he finally returned to his apartment, Brad locked the front door 3 times, sank onto the sofa for no more than a minute, then sprang up and headed straight for the bedroom. He opened the wooden cabinet beneath the dressing table and retrieved his second phone, unregistered, with no primary SIM, reserved for the relationships the official files called off the books. He powered it on, scrolled to the last message thread, no contact name, only an initial and a time stamp under 48 hours old, and reread his final sent line, "Is she alive?" Without a word, he smashed the device. The first blow only cracked it, he snarled, grabbed it again and struck the corner of the desk a second time, shattering it. Glass fragments tinkled sharply across the wooden floor, punctuating his waiting with a decisive, full stop. He then turned to his liquor cabinet and took down a long undisturbed bottle of dark bourbon. He removed the cork slowly, his hands steady but each movement weighted by tension held together by muscle rather than reason. He poured the liquid to the brim of a glass, lifted it without drinking, and fixed his gaze on the dark surface as though he saw his reflection sinking to the bottom. At last, he croaked a sentence, half to himself, half to someone absent. "Don't let her live." It was neither neither an order nor a plea, but a first fracture, dry, offbeat, and naked. He knew that if Kenya Mallory survived, every denial, every amended report, every dispersed witness would become meaningless, and if she truly was an agent, not only the media, but the entire federal system would turn back every word, every statement, every gesture he had made that bloody morning. He closed his eyes, drained the glass, tilted his head back into the chair, his breath ragged and his throat as dry as ash. It was no longer fear, it was the hunger to survive beginning to devour the man accustomed to pinning others to the pavement. The next morning, a video filmed from the second-floor balcony of a house near the scene suddenly appeared on Twitter, rapidly gaining massive engagement. Unedited, no soundtrack, no effects, it was a clip under 20 seconds long, beginning with Kenya Mallory standing still in the street, her hands motionless, the early sunlight slanting across her orange vest shoulders, making her stand out against the sun-drenched sidewalk. Opposite her stood Brad Cutler, angled to the right. His voice was unclear in the clip, but his face and gestures were fully visible. Then, as if interrupted by a brutal silence, a harsh sound rang out. Kenya's body collapsed, bending instinctively, leaning to the right, knees buckling, arms clutching her abdomen. In that moment, the frame seemed to freeze. Then a shout erupted from behind the camera, breaking voice. "She stood still. She did nothing at all." The video was quickly reshared tens of thousands of times within the first 2 hours. It was not legal evidence, but a direct blow to every firewall built around Brad. Under the original tweet were countless comments, hundreds tagging friends and sharing the question, why shoot someone who didn't move? A hashtag began to trend, simple and sharp. She did not move. At the same time, another followed, shot for standing. Those two phrases became symbols. Without organized campaigns or hired media teams, social media users automatically changed their profile pictures, overlaid white text on orange vests. Some recreated the moment Kenya stood still, her face looking forward in a still photo where her eyes seemed to hold a long history of suppressed pain. Others cut out the segment of Brad aiming the gun and added the caption, "He thought she would never be known." An independent journalist clipped the video into a short midday news report, bluntly commenting on the live stream. "We are witnessing a shooting in broad daylight in front of civilians where the victim showed no threatening behavior. If this is order maintenance, then we need to reconsider the very definition of order under which we live." The police officer tried to respond with an urgent statement, repeating old arguments about suspected unusual behavior and response to a potentially risky situation. But this time, the public no longer accepted those words as before. Comments under the official post were flooded with screenshots from the video, accompanied by sarcasm. Not a speck of dust on her sleeves moved, and yet they called it a threat? In a sociology class hundreds of miles away at a state university, the professor began the lecture with that very clip. He showed the image of Kenya collapsing without warning, then asked the students, "In this country, what more must black women do to prove they don't deserve to be killed in the street?" Questions like these spread far beyond expectations. From social media, they crept into student groups, law offices, citizenship classes, and even dinners where politics was rarely discussed. But the video forced people to no longer pretend they did not see. The image of a woman falling through her neither approached nor moved became a symbol for something greater than the event itself. It was no longer just Kenya Mallory. It was a question society had to face. How many people have fallen because of prejudiced gazes pulling the trigger? And this time, the answer was no longer in Brad's hands. In the middle of the afternoon, an open letter was published by a group of former black federal agents who once served under the FBI. Signed in full, the letter was sent directly to the Department of Justice and rapidly spread across social media. In their message, they wrote concisely, avoiding flowery language, instead focusing on the emotions and anger bottled up over many years. The opening line cut sharply through the tense atmosphere. She did not deserve that bullet. They referred to Kenya Mallory not by title, but by her real name. as a comrade, a younger sister, part of an organization that once believed wearing a federal badge meant being protected by the law. The letter offered no excuses, no plea for sympathy. It simply listed the facts, from the moment she was stopped, questioned, forced to turn around, to the instant the trigger was pulled in a residential street. They did not ask the system to reconsider, but made a firm statement. We will not be silent if this case is covered up for one more day. Directly beneath the original post were thousands of comments from readers of all backgrounds. A retired serviceman confirmed, "We worked with her on a case 2 years ago. Kenya Mallory is one of the best I know, not just for her skills, but because she stays calm even when treated like a criminal." Another shared an old photo taken with Kenya at her agent training graduation ceremony, where she stood at the top of her class, her smile faint but her eyes straight and proud, requiring no display. At the same time, a live stream suddenly appeared from the account of an approximately 11-year-old girl living across the street from the scene. The video began with heavy breathing and a small hand trembling while holding the phone. The shaky frame showed the sidewalk in front of the house, where blood still stained the pavement like ink not yet dry. The girl's voice rose, unclear but determined, as if she knew every word could become evidence. "I was inside the house, looking through the window. I saw. She did nothing." The police officer asked, "But Dee, she did not kneel. I think they arrested her because she refused to kneel." A simple statement, without analysis or unnecessary detail. Yet, precisely because of that, it carried the weight that made adults fall silent. Within an hour, the live stream was clipped, subtitled, and spread to TikTok and fast news platforms. Adults debated, analyzed, and cited laws. The child simply spoke the truth of instinct. The police were not angry about a crime, but about someone refusing to comply as expected. From that moment, the story went beyond a case of police violence. It became a questioning of the relationship between law enforcement and citizens, especially those with skin color other than white. Viewers no longer asked, "Why was the bullet fired?" but began to ask, "What kind of system have we built that a trigger can be pulled just because someone stands tall?" Kenya Mallory remained in intensive care, unconscious, yet her silence spoke for millions who had been pressured to bow their heads. This time, it included those inside the system, like the group of former federal agents who once believed in the title but now defended one of their own. Outside on the streets, children were learning a lesson earlier than adults wanted. Not everyone wearing a uniform represents justice. While the city remained engulfed in chaos from the wave of outrage on social media, a special investigation team from the Federal Bureau of Investigation was urgently deployed to the state just hours after the video went viral. The plane landed at the military airport at midnight, without prior announcement or press interviews. Only a convoy of 4 vehicles turned into the State Police Administrative Complex at 2 p.m. The leader of the team was Senior Agent Edric Monroe, who had previously handled serious internal cases related to abuses of power and violent conduct. He appeared in civilian clothes, carrying a thick file, his eyes calm, as if having witnessed too many similar scenes. But this time, first thing that struck him upon entering the local headquarters was a chilling silence, as if someone had just extinguished a fire with gas. Brad Cutler received the summons from the Internal Affairs Office right after the new shift began. He entered the preliminary interrogation room with a straight posture, trying to maintain composure despite the lingering smell of alcohol around his shirt collar. The room was simply arranged with only 3 chairs, a pressed wood table, and a recording device already switched on. Agent Monroe wasted no time. He sat down, opened the file, placed a still photo extracted from the video in front of Brad, and asked, "This is the moment you pulled the trigger." Before that, the victim was standing still. "I want you to explain every second." Brad leaned back in the chair, eyes fixed on the photo, then looked up, his voice hoarse. "I saw something reflecting, flashing beneath the clothes, a piece of metal, small but shiny. I thought it was a gun." His voice did not tremble, but the last syllable was drawn out as if gauging whether his listener believed him. Monroe did not respond immediately, only nodded slightly, then made notes on the report board. "Did you order the victim to raise her hands?" Monroe asked next. Brad shook his head. "I told her to turn around, hands behind her neck. She didn't comply, still stood looking at me. The agent wrote a few lines again, then stopped. So, can we say you fired at a time when there was no clear threatening action from the victim? Brad looked at him, for the first time showing signs of breathlessness. I acted on instinct. I had seen colleagues shot at close range for being a second late. She stood like she was challenging me. As he uttered this last sentence, the atmosphere in the room seemed to thicken. Monroe looked up, closed his pen, then spoke slowly, not raising his voice, but each word cutting sharply. "You're saying that because she stood straight, you considered her a threat?" Brad said nothing, eyes lowered. The interrogation lasted less than 30 minutes, but was enough to record the necessary details. The investigation team did not rush to conclusions, but the notes were sent straight to the FBI headquarters within an hour. In the hallway, as Brad left the room, the two accompanying officers said nothing, but their looks shifted from colleagues to guards. His footsteps echoed on the tiled floor with a dry, steady, soulless sound, like a soundtrack to the moment of a man leaving the last safe zone he clung to. That evening, a brief news report from the FBI aired on federal television, confirming that a task force had officially launched an investigation and that all information related to the case would be examined independently. The report mentioned neither Brad's name nor Kenya's, yet the whole nation knew who they were. The local authorities' silence was replaced by a higher-level supervision order. From that moment, every testimony, every glance, every breath held in reports became facts no one could erase. In a small meeting room, white ceiling lights shone down on a spotless wooden table, gray curtains tightly drawn behind the federal agents. Edric Monroe, the investigator coordinating the case, held a copy of the original video, with frames analyzed down to thousandths of a second, close-up zooms, slow motion, tracing every move Brad Cutler made from the moment he touched his holster until the bullet left the barrel. Sitting opposite, Brad no longer wore his usual arrogance, his head bowed, hands clasped on his lap, as if holding on to the last remnants of self-control. Monroe spoke calmly, his tone steady but cold. "Do you know that in every frame we captured, there is no moment showing her holding anything in her hands?" He did not ask to probe, but to assert, cloaking a statement within a question to see how far the questioned man would push himself backward. Brad lifted his head halfway, eyes slightly red but dry, jaw tightening before immediately dropping again. He did not answer right away. For several seconds, only the hum of the air conditioner filled the corner of the ceiling. The other agents' gazes fixed on him like gravity thickening the air. Finally, Brad spoke, his voice low and weary. "I did not observe. I reacted as trained." The words sounded like an escape route, rehearsed long ago, as if repeated 10 times in front of a mirror, waiting for the moment to be spoken. But that perfection made it shameless. Monroe did not respond immediately. He stared at Brad for a few more seconds, then gently put down his pen, opened a file next to him, and pulled out an internal training manual. "I commanded the FBI training class for 4 years, he said, flipping through pages until stopping at a bolded line. "Use deadly force only if there is a clear and immediate threat to life." He slid the paper toward Brad, fingertips holding one corner. "We do not train our people to pull the trigger out of impatience. Or are you saying the local police department has its standards?" Brad looked at the paper, then avoided Monroe's eyes. No one spoke further. It was unnecessary. That moment, silence spoke volumes. He no longer resisted, but did not apologize. All struggles had moved past justification. What the task force wanted to know now was, did it happen because of error, ignorance, or a conscious choice? The questioning session ended without a specific conclusion, but the recording was sealed and sent immediately to the Coordination Center in Washington. When Brad left the room, the federal officers neither escorted him nor spoke. They simply turned to the next witness on their list, ready for the next session. But behind Brad, the atmosphere had shifted. No one still believed he acted purely on instinct. None of those at the table believed a federal agent could be identified as a threat simply for standing tall and wearing a vest. Outside in the hallway, the rain had just stopped, the light reflecting off the wet stone floor in faint streaks. Brad walked out slowly, no longer hurried, no longer rushing, his figure heavy as if all the weight on his shoulders was focused at a point of no return. There was nothing left to say, and for those handling this case file, nothing left to negotiate. The story had entered a phase where defense began to be seen as confession. "Hey, after dinner, I'll be taking you back to your room." 3 days after the federal investigation team set foot in the state, a series of independent investigative reports by a group of veteran journalists were published on the front pages of 3 major newspapers. Not stopping at the shooting incident, they dug into Brad Cutler's past, tracing personnel files, internal reports, and even anonymous letters that had been previously ignored. Among the decoded documents, one detail shocked public opinion. Brad had been involved in 5 complaints related to racial discrimination during his 8 years of service. 3 of these never reached the disciplinary board because they were put aside for internal handling. The remaining 2 were voted on but ended with a tie, no conclusions, and no disciplinary sanctions. The official reason in the minutes: insufficient evidence to conclude serious violation. The investigative report went further, quoting a former employee who had worked alongside Brad for 2 years in a neighboring district. This person, whose identity was kept confidential for legal reasons, provided an 8-page statement, including a notable excerpt. He kept a small tan notebook listing individuals he considered deserving of a lesson. I once saw it when he left it on the back seat of the patrol car. All the names were of black people, mostly living in poor neighborhoods. There were notes like "often stands at the corner," "attitude like a snitch," or simply "arrogant faith." This information was cross-referenced with GPS tracking data from the patrol car Brad used, and the results sent chills down readers. Of more than 60 stops not requested by superiors, 85% of the targets were black, most with no clear traffic violations. An independent expert in police behavior analysis commented on television, "We cannot continue to call this accidental. When an individual displays a clear, selective behavioral pattern, lists and marks people by race, that is systemic intent." The final article in the series, titled "The City Knew and Stayed Silent," directly questioned city authorities and the police department. Why was an officer with such a behavioral history not reviewed earlier? The answer was the familiar phrases, "no legal basis," "unable to verify discriminatory intent," and "the internal handling system followed procedure." But this time, readers no longer accepted those empty words. A wave of anger surged again, this time targeting not only Brad but the entire system that had sheltered him. In a live interview program, the host bluntly asked a former police chief who had coordinated personnel at the time, "If you had 5 complaints against one officer, what would you call that?" He was silent for nearly 7 seconds. Then sighed, looking straight into the camera. "A broken system." The information about the notebook quickly spread across platforms, from forums to classrooms, from journalists' walls to law students' phone screens. In the public eye, Brad Cutler was no longer a momentary outburst. He was the product of prolonged permission, intentional neglect, and the clearest manifestation of the question the whole country had to ask: how many times have we accepted silence so that abuse of power could continue? And this time, silence was no longer an option. At a federally affiliated hospital far from the city center, where security was so tight that every entrance had independent surveillance cameras and biometric scan codes, Kenya Mallory remained motionless. Her coma had lasted over 6 days, with no signs of active brain recovery despite stable biological reflexes. A specialized medical team from Washington was dispatched, working alongside local healthcare to monitor every minor change. Outside the ICU room door, 2 agents guarded in shifts, changing every 4 hours, ensuring that no one could access her without 2-layered identification codes. The reason was that her identity was no longer a personal matter, but had become a federal security focal point. The investigation agency determined that Kenya was not only an agent, but also held the role of overseeing federal cases involving racial conflicts across 4 southern states. Her work had made several powerful groups within law enforcement uncomfortable. This also meant that insiders like Monroe could not ignore the possibility that someone wanted this case silenced before she woke up. There was even a high-level security order on all her medical data. No doctor was allowed to discuss it via unencrypted phone calls or emails. Amid public tension running high, a live primetime television interview silenced the nation. The guest was Special Agent Vivian Banks, Kenya's direct superior in the Internal Affairs Unit. She appeared in a light gray suit without a badge, her hair neatly tied back, her voice calm at the start of the program, yet unable to hide red, swollen eyes despite makeup efforts. When asked, "What made you feel this case crossed normal boundary?" Vivian briefly bowed her head, then looked up and replied, "We don't shoot our own, but Brad did." The words were spoken slowly but struck deeply into the consciousness of a fracturing system. Her gaze fixed on the camera without blinking, as if looking straight at each viewer. Then her lips pressed lightly together, but her voice remained clear. "We have investigated arms dealers, confronted sophisticated criminal networks. None of them ever made Kenya fall. She lives by discipline, works by honor. Yet just for standing still by the roadside, she was taken down by a cop as if she were a moving target." Vivian paused, quickly wiped away a tear, then composed herself. Yet that moment allowed the audience to truly feel the wound inside an agency long seen as resilient and silent before public scrutiny. They were used to investigation, rebuttal, and presenting evidence. But when one of their own became a victim, the pain was no longer about the work, but about honor, stabbed directly by a gun from one who should stand for justice. The interview ended in silence. No calls to action, no slogans, only the swollen eyes of a colleague and a broken voice at the end of the program. "I don't know if she will wake up, but if she does, I want Kenya to know this time we will not let anyone cover up again." Those words spread faster than any sensational news because they were true. So true that public opinion could not turn away. In the cold, brightly lit room, Kenya Mallory remained unconscious, but outside, millions had already begun to awaken. The City Hall held an emergency meeting at 7 a.m. without prior notice to the press and no permission for filming. The entire meeting area was sealed off by Internal Affairs Police. In the closed room were only council members, city lawyers, representatives from the governor's office, and a silent figure sitting at the back, unnamed, a special envoy from the Department of Justice. Every seat was filled, no one appeared relaxed, and no room was left for avoidance. The chairperson was Councilwoman Bethany Cole, known for her moderate stance, but this time opening with a statement that silenced the room. "How many times have we promised voters that something like this will never happen again?" No one answered. Some hands clenched on file folders, others glanced at the closed window. Some turned to the city lawyer, waiting for a defense statement, but he merely shook his head lightly. All preventive arguments had become a farce when a new clip leaked from an anonymous source. The clip, under 10 seconds, captured the moment after Brad Cutler shot Kenya Mallory and walked toward the patrol car. The angle from a resident's security camera at the corner clearly showed. He was smiling. The image showed Brad turning his face to his teammate, eyes gleaming, mumbling something before opening the car door. The audio, amplified and quoted in an internal report, said, "That stubborn girl." The lazy tone was like someone who just finished an uneven fight with no remorse or caution. This was not the reaction of someone facing danger. It was the attitude of a man who saw himself victorious in a show of dominance. The clip quickly circulated among journalists outside City Hall. Although the meeting had not ended, a long line of citizens appeared outside holding banners, tense faces, shouting demands to fire and prosecute Brad echoed from the square. A group of local university students brought megaphones, loudly reading Brad's words from the video as a living indictment. Internal Affairs Police deployed forces to maintain order, but no one intervened to disperse because the crowd remained silent, as if the outrage was loud enough to transcend shouting. Inside the meeting room, another council member, silent all session, spoke up, eyes fixed on the police representative. "I once voted to protect the system, but after watching the video, I cannot call this an accident. It was intentional." The police representative looked away, his face no longer holding its firmness. Usually, such meetings would end with a neutral conclusion, but this time, a special resolution was passed by emergency vote, recommending prosecuting Brad Cutler under federal law, demanding full transfer of personnel files, and establishing an independent inspection team for the entire Southern Police District. Meanwhile, major media outlets set up field studios outside City Hall. The clip was broadcast nationwide less than an hour later. The phrase, "that stubborn girl," immediately became the focus of analysis. Some language experts described it as an expression of contempt for the victim, denying her humanity. A criminal psychologist commented on live television, "That is the language of someone who has done this before and has never been stopped." That afternoon, at the private home of an African-American congressman who had served 6 terms but rarely spoke on racial issues, he called the governor's office and said a simple sentence, "I no longer have the strength to convince my child that the system will protect them, and that is the cruelest failure." This statement, later revealed internally, became the opening line of a special report on the loss of trust in the community. A bullet can cause injury, but a smile after the shot can kill an entire belief in justice. One day, after an emergency meeting at City Hall, a veteran federal lawyer named Wallace Ruddington announced he would represent Kenya Mallory's family. He appeared on national television, calm but with words sharp as a blade. The 10-minute interview needed only one statement to shift public opinion. "This is a criminal act. There is no debate." He emphasized no emotions, no political rallying, only legal logic. A federal agent was shot by a local officer, unarmed, in a situation without a clear threat. Then the perpetrator smiled and walked away. Under the law, this exceeded the limits of force, constituted intentional, serious bodily injury, and obstructed investigation if there was evidence of initial report tampering. That same afternoon, his law firm announced plans to request a special grand jury at the federal court to decide on prosecution. They also demanded that the police department hand over all internal records, including training reports, complaint histories, and a list of Brad's past uses of force. His press secretary added, "We will not prosecute based on emotions, we prosecute based on evidence." While support for Kenya continued to grow, Brad Cutler chose to appear on a local conservative news channel. In a carefully staged live interview, he sat in a leather chair with the American flag in the background, wearing his old police badge as a subtle statement. The host asked, "Do you think you were wrong?" Brad sighed, looking toward the camera, as if speaking to the nation. "I am a law enforcer. No one wants police to be destroyed by personal emotion." His voice sounded calm, but his words were defensive and sarcastic. The host pressed, "Then why did you draw your gun?" Brad glanced sideways, refusing a direct answer. "Police do not have the privilege to wait until being shot. We must act, and sometimes that action is not as graceful as people want." This answer drew mixed reactions. Some right-wing media quoted him to defend his actions, but most of the public saw clear evasion of responsibility. That very night, videos analyzing every second of movement by Kenya Mallory and Brad Cutler were widely shared again, this time with subtitles debunking his arguments. A prominent human rights organization posted a direct response. "Law enforcers do not shoot innocent people, then smile and walk away. That is not lawful behavior. That is criminal conduct." Public patience seemed exhausted. On social media platforms, more and more people, including former police officers and military personnel, called for Brad's immediate suspension of all pay and the earliest possible criminal prosecution. At a suburban high school, a history teacher showed Brad's interview for student analysis. A black female student in 11th grade stood and said, "If the law allows him to do that and then smile, who will protect my mother, my sister, or me on the way to school?" The question echoed in the small classroom but resonated like a warning for the whole nation, because when justice speaks with the voice of the shooter, the rest have only 2 choices: speak up or be shot next. 3 days after her final surgery, Kenya Mallory opened her eyes. The dim light from the ceiling filtered through dry eyelashes, and everything around her seemed blurred, as if veiled by mist. Yet her heartbeat was steady, her nervous system responding as expected by the medical team, and more importantly, her gaze, though weak, never wavered. Her pupils gradually regained the sharp coldness familiar to an agent who had led dozens of complex counterintelligence cases. The nurse on duty immediately reported upstairs to the coordination floor, and within 10 minutes, the door opened for the only person in her unit she ever called her true teammate to enter. His name was Marcus Dillard, who had worked closely with Kenya in her early career before transferring to counterintelligence, but maintained contact. His face was solemn, unable to hide fatigue. He stood beside her bed, silent for 3 seconds, then leaned close and spoke quietly but firmly. "Do you know they're playing games?" Kenya did not nod immediately. She blinked once, slowly shifting her gaze from the IV drip to the uniform he wore. When she looked up and nodded slowly, their eyes met, and a cold certainty surged through the room like an electric current. Marcus gently held her hand, careful not to touch the still bandaged wound. "I reviewed all the data. The first report was altered. They deleted the first part of Brad's radio transmission, where he called the station, describing you as suspicious, non-compliant, and potentially threatening. But the original recorded it as black subject, standing straight, wearing a vest, looking at me with a strange attitude." Marcus paused to let Kenya absorb the information. She did not blink, but her lips pressed slightly. He continued, "I sent the original to superiors. They haven't responded yet. I think there's pressure to blur the motives." Kenya tried to grip his hand, but he was still too weak. Yet the muscle twitches on her face showed full awareness. Marcus sat down on the chair beside her, eyes lingering on the wound on her abdomen, where the gauze, still soaked with dried blood, remained. "We won't let this go. You need rest, but also preparation. When the full report is released, they'll try to turn the questions around. Why a federal agent didn't identify herself during the stop, why you didn't comply." Kenya tilted her head slightly, lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came. Marcus pulled out a small piece of paper from his jacket pocket and wrote a short line with a pencil. "I am still an agent." He held it up before her. Kenya looked and nodded once, slowly but decisively. He added in a low voice, "They want you silent, but we need you to speak, because if you stay silent, this will be called a professional mistake, and he'll vanish from the radar, like the others before." She closed her eyes for a few seconds, then opened them again. This time her gaze was no longer blurred. She glanced toward the door and signaled with her eyes. Marcus understood, stood up, turned the door handle, and before leaving, said one sentence, "They've seen you alive. Now they will be afraid." As the door closed, the light in the room seemed clearer. The heart monitor kept blinking steadily, but the woman lying on the bed was no longer a patient awaiting recovery. She was a living witness to a system strangling itself with lies, and Kenya Mallory had just awakened in time to expose every thread. The next morning, the head doctor of the treatment unit entered the room, holding a chart and some new test samples. But before he could speak, Kenya Mallory tilted her head, slightly lifted it off the pillow, and spoke clearly and firmly, each word like a strategic command. "I want to go to court. No apologies, no settlements." The statement silenced the room. Even the nurse stopped tending the wound. The elderly doctor, who had witnessed hundreds of psychological recoveries after trauma, nodded with understanding but could not hide surprise. He did not see a patient in need of comfort, but a survivor ready to overturn the game. News of Kenya's awakening and ability to speak circulated within the first hour. In less than 60 minutes, the FBI's Washington office convened a special internal meeting attended by 4 top federal litigation attorneys, a special case coordinator, and 2 emergency media analysts. All case data, from witness videos, interrogation transcripts, surveillance device information at the scene, to Brad Cutler's personnel history, were compiled into a nearly 300-page file, divided into 4 independently managed groups. The lead attorney coordinating the group was Sylvia Griggs, head of the Federal Criminal Litigation Division, renowned for handling politically sensitive cases. She was the first to speak at the meeting. "We do not seek an apology, we prosecute." Her voice was calm, but each word struck the conference table like iron nails. She proposed 2 counterclaims. First, charging Brad Cutler with intentional serious bodily injury, causing particularly severe consequences. Second, investigating the local police department's responsibility in facilitating motive concealment and report falsification. Both charges fell under federal court jurisdiction if supported by the direct victim, and now Kenya Mallory had confirmed that. That very afternoon, a team of legal experts arrived at the hospital, bringing encrypted computers, authorized audio recorders, and a draft preliminary testimony. They were instructed not to pressure Kenya, but only to provide information allowing her to choose her level of involvement. Yet upon entering the room, before a word was spoken, Kenya pointed at the draft. "I will sign the official copy, but I want to review every line." She leaned back against the pillows, pushing the thick blanket down to her lap, eyes fixed on the documents. 2 hours later, the completed testimony was signed and returned to the office. One of the lawyers present later recounted, "She did not speak much, but her eyes made it clear this was no longer a lawsuit. It was a campaign." The FBI's official initiation of the counterclaim file was announced that evening via a brief but pointed press release. "We have documented all related details. An agent was shot under unreasonable circumstances. We will pursue justice to the fullest extent permitted by law." There were no rallying cries, no provocative tones, yet the entire national media system understood the game had changed. Brad Cutler no longer faced an unconscious victim. He now confronted a system where, this time, the law enforcer had truly awakened, and they sought not reconciliation, they sought judgment. That morning, the federal courthouse was more crowded than usual, the press jostling outside. Legal analysts filling every public seat, many dressed in dark suits as if mourning an unspoken truth. Amid the sea of cameras and anticipation, Brad Cutler appeared. He did not wear his familiar uniform, but a plain black suit, a white shirt buttoned to the collar, and a silent gray tie. Gone were the arrogant eyes and the forced smile after the gunshot, seen in the viral clip. He walked slowly, hesitant steps, head slightly bowed, hands clasped in front of his abdomen as if trying to steady himself. He avoided everyone's gaze, including the reporters calling his name from both sides of the security gate. This was the first time since the incident that Brad appeared as someone who knew fear. Down the hall, the rear door from the security elevator opened, and Kenya Mallory appeared. The wheelchair rolled softly on the polished stone floor. No one stood, no one dared to breathe heavily. She wore a dark suit, shoulders straight, collar unbuttoned, hair tied high, eyes staring straight ahead without searching. No scarf, no covering over her wounds. White gauze peeked from the left side of her jacket, tinged with the faint pink of old blood. Yet her eyes held no weakness or pain. They were sharp like steel forged in fire, and as she paused by the waiting benches before the trial, the entire space seemed compressed into a tense silence. A veteran reporter remarked after that morning, "He walked in as if hoping for forgiveness. She was pushed in as if ready to spare a life but not the crime." When the two crossed paths in the hallway, less than 4 meters apart, Brad glanced up briefly, then quickly looked away. Kenya held her gaze exactly there, not shifting an inch. 2 FBI agents stood behind her, silent. They understood that silence at this moment was heavier than any rebuttal. Inside the courtroom, the public was not allowed to film or record, but the press could take notes. Transcripts from attendees showed, when the presiding judge entered, Brad slowly stood, blinking repeatedly like someone trying to hide fear. His lawyer placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, but he dared not look toward Kenya's seat. She was brought in through a private entrance, seated beside her legal representative and 2 FBI assistants. Though the only one dressed in dark among the witnesses, Kenya became the center of attention, not out of sympathy, but because of her unyielding presence. As the prosecutor read the indictment, listing misconduct, Kenya's eyes never left the words. Each time phrases like abuse of power or excessive force were mentioned, she slightly tilted her head, as if committing every sentence to long-term memory. No one in the room saw her as merely a victim. She was a witness bearing the face of survival and resistance, the voice the entire system had once tried to bury with false reports and manipulative excuses. The trial had just begun, but Brad Cutler already understood he could no longer step back. The girl he once aimed his gun at in the middle of the street now sat upright in daylight before justice, like a cold blade needing no sheath. And he, who once believed he had the right to choose who lived, faced a final choice: tell the truth or be exposed by what he left behind. Brad's defense attorney rose to the stand, his tailored gray suit seeming to mask the tension in his voice. He opened calmly, but with a clear intent to guide the jury's emotions. My client reacted in a moment so brief it cannot be measured. A split second, he emphasized, then paused, scanning the courtroom as if gauging reaction. He saw a reflection, and he was stressed. Put yourself in the shoes of a police officer on an uncertain morning, unaware of what might happen. No one wants the worst to occur, but it did. This was not intentional. A few eyes dropped. Some spectators furrowed brows, but most remained silent. The only one unblinking was Kenya Mallory. She sat straight in her wheelchair, hands resting on her lap, eyes cold as a sharp blade waiting to strike. Beside her, the plaintiff's female attorney stood, slender, yet with eyes shining cold intelligence like glass polished by the harshest trials. She did not need a presentation. She stepped forward, nodded to the judge, then turned to the jury. I refuse to call this a split second, she began, her voice low but every word clear. I call it the crystallization of a decade of hatred, the consequence of 5 suppressed complaints, the sediment of prejudice Mr. Cutler poured onto every black woman who dared meet his gaze. This is not reflex. This is a reaction trained by contempt. A wave of silence enveloped the courtroom, then pens began hurriedly taking notes. The lawyer paused, pulling from her briefcase a printed photo of the scene. Kenya collapsed on the pavement, blood spreading over the gray concrete. She raised it without explanation. Setting the photo down, she continued, a bullet not fired errantly. It required a finger to squeeze the trigger, and that finger belonged to someone who viewed her life as disposable. Kenya slightly tilted her head, as if no agreement was needed because everything was already clear. In the press row, a journalist quickly typed notes. No one shouted, but every word from the plaintiff's side struck precisely at the mask of defense. Brad Cutler sat silently, hands clenched, spine bent forward. His lawyer placed a hand on his notes, lightly crossing out the phrase "split second" 3 times. At that moment, he knew those words would become acid rain in the eyes of the public. When the trial recessed mid-morning, the FBI legal team stepped into the hallway, others sliding aside to make way. No further explanation was needed. That morning's argument was not merely legal, it was a bell ringing straight at society's perception of occupational accidents by law enforcement. Brad could dodge answers, make excuses, but the image of Kenya seated center court with a white bandage across her abdomen would repeat in every news report. The confrontation had moved to a different playing field, where words were no longer tactics but evidence, and this time, justice was not late. It arrived just as Brad began to fear the next second. Kenya Mallory was led to the witness stand, but upon reaching the center of the courtroom, she signaled to stand. An FBI assistant stepped forward to support her, holding her arm and back as she leaned out of the wheelchair. She stood, legs trembling slightly but straight, eyes scanning both the jury and the man bowed at the defendant's table. I don't need pity, she began, her voice hoarse but clear. I stand here because he pointed a gun at my chest, not because he feared I had a weapon, but because he couldn't handle that I wasn't afraid of him. The courtroom froze. Kenya spoke each sentence as if throwing the previous excuses back in their faces. He's used to giving orders. He's used to seeing people like me flustered. I just stood there. I asked why I was stopped. That was too much for a man who cannot accept anyone outside his control. Her tone deepened, without a tear, only steady breaths like those she'd taken through hearings in her career. If that day I had panicked, I might still be alive without surgery. But because I stood straight, he pulled the trigger. The plaintiff's attorney requested to play the original, unedited clip directly from a witness's balcony camera. The courtroom lights dimmed, the large screen lit up, and silence stretched as the frame appeared. Kenya wore an orange vest, standing by the car, arms at her sides, early sunlight casting half her face. Brad approached, hand resting on the holster. Every gesture unfolded without cut, correction, or narration. The audience held their breath at the crucial moment. Brad drew his gun, stepped back half a step, arm raised. In real time, it all took 2 seconds. Slowed down, his eyes revealed tension but no tremor. His finger pressed the trigger, squeezed down exactly on target, no flinch, no mistake. She collapsed immediately after the shot, clutching her abdomen, mouth open, but no sound. Local police arrived late in the clip, none showing surprise. It was at the end Brad turned and spoke softly into the radio, his voice clear. "That stubborn girl." Lights returned. The atmosphere thickened. No one dared move. One juror, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair, sat upright, eyes reddened. Brad did not raise his head, hands clenched as if holding control. His face was pale, no longer the confident look from his first summons. Kenya turned once toward the jury, silently signaling, "You have seen it all." The FBI attorney nodded gently at her, then requested to add documentation proving the clip was digitally unaltered. No one objected. The courtroom understood that the footage needed no subtitles or explanation. It was the most accurate testimony for why Kenya Mallory stood there on legs almost lost, and why Brad Cutler was sinking deeper into the hole he dug with his finger on the trigger. Justice is not always swift, but when it has clear evidence, it cuts sharp like broken glass into the tissue of crime. One day after the original clip was shown in court, the plaintiff called a criminal psychologist with over 20 years of experience analyzing behavioral cues in emergencies. He was invited to the witness stand as an independent analyst, unaffiliated with either prosecution or the FBI. Opening his presentation, he produced several enlarged prints from the video shown the day before. His voice was unhurried, each word measured, like the hammer strikes of a metal worker, checking cracks on an iron armor. "Let us look at this frame." He pointed to an enlarged photo, clearly showing Brad Cutler's face as his hand rested on the trigger. Eyebrows lowered, pupils focused, lips slightly pressed. All indicate a state of deliberate control. There are no signs of facial muscle contraction, no loss of control typical of panic reactions. He moved on to the next image, capturing the moment the bullet left the barrel. If he truly reacted out of fear, facial muscles would contract, eyes widen, and the ips part for rapid breathing. None of these signs appear here. I conclude, Brad Cutler's trigger pull occurred in a mentally stable and consciously controlled state. In the tense atmosphere, jurors began taking more detailed notes. Their pen strokes grew heavier, no longer cursory jottings. One looked up, then added again, as if afraid to miss any critical detail. Another frowned while comparing the defense attorney's prior description with the analysis now displayed. Kenya's lawyer stepped forward to ask, her tone neutral, aiming to clarify facts rather than evoke emotion. "So, according to you, the shooting was not an instinctive reaction?" "Exactly," the expert replied. "This was a deliberate act, based on preformed judgments and emotions. If he harbored prejudice or discriminatory bias, that decision to shoot would be directly influenced by it." A female juror marked the phrase preformed emotions. She added no explanation, simply framed it with 2 underlines. Her gaze flicked toward Brad, who sat passively at the defendant's table, hands tightly clasped over his abdomen, eyes no longer raised but fixed on a vacant spot. There were times when Brad remembered feeling disoriented, like he had been suddenly clasped over his abdomen, eyes no longer raised but fixed on a vacant spot. The judge asked a single question. "Can you confirm that this analysis is free from influence by any party?" "I confirm," the expert responded immediately. "I work independently, based solely on evidence. Anyone with emergency response experience can recognize that it is not a fear response. This is the execution of an act by will." The clerk's gavel struck as the presentation ended, but instead of the usual murmurs, the room remained silent, as if sealed shut. Everyone understood what had been heard was not just testimony but a direct cut into Brad's final facade. Nothing left to hide behind. No reflex, no mistake, no panic causing a slip of the trigger. Only a calm face pulling the trigger for a deeper reason. Everyone understood, but the shooter himself had yet to admit it. The courtroom became a place where every word of the psychological expert echoed like chains being dragged, stripping away the layers of pretense once built around the defense. And every stroke of the pen inscribed on paper before the jurors was something Brad Cutler could no longer control. He once controlled the fears of others, but now he was powerless before justice's memory. A black man, thin but standing firmly, was called to the witness stand on the 14th day of the trial. His name was Marcus Rowe, a resident of the same district where Kenya Mallory's incident occurred. When asked to recount his personal experience, he did not look toward the lawyer nor seek reassurance from those seated nearby. He looked directly at the jury, as if knowing that what he was about to say might not shock anyone, but had to be spoken by a real person, not through paper. "I was once shoved into the trunk of my car by Brad Cutler," he began, his voice steady and deep. "I was walking home from a convenience store wearing a gray zip-up hoodie. I held a loaf of bread and a bottle of water in my hands. No one robs a house carrying dinner." He paused briefly, smiling faintly. E.T. followed me and turned on his siren even though I was just walking. When I turned back, he yelled, "Put your hands up!" I complied, but within seconds he kicked my knee hard and dragged me straight into the patrol car, stuffing me in the trunk. When I asked why, he said, "Because you dress like a problem." I was never considered a suspect and received no apology. The jury began to shift. A white woman in the front row leaned slightly forward, lips pressed tight. The youngest juror quietly marked a note on his paper. Marcus stepped down without guidance. Before the air could cool, the next witness was called. She was Grace Min, a former officer who served with Brad Cutler nearly 4 years ago. The Asian woman wore a plain blouse, hair neatly tied at the nape. Though no longer in the force, she stepped to the stand like someone who had never lost her dignity. "I reported Brad to our direct supervisor," she said. "At that time I was a rookie, and he called me names that should not be repeated in this courtroom. But I reported him not just for the words, I reported him because he grabbed the collar of a black young man simply because the man looked back during a stop. That look broke no law. But to Brad, it was a provocation." Grace's voice did not waver. "After the report, I was transferred to the administrative department." The plaintiff's attorney added no questions. She merely nodded to Grace, then asked the court to accept the testimony as additional evidence of repeated systemic behavior. The jury bowed their heads again, writing more intensely. What was spoken was no empty accusation, but a complete piece of the picture everyone had seen, partly from the video, from expert analysis, and Kenya's expression, standing in court. Brad Cutler sat at the back, his posture slumping. His eyes darted between the floor and the ceiling, avoiding the witness's gaze. The atmosphere had shifted, not just anger, but the steady rise of truth breaking through. Brad's legal defenses were crumbling. 2 testimonies from a civilian and a former colleague were shaking his entire defense. The jury understood this was not about one trigger pull, but a lifetime of deliberate wrongdoing. That afternoon, retired Internal Affairs investigator Ronald Miles testified. With over 30 years in law enforcement, including a decade handling abuse and racial discrimination complaints, he spoke without notes, as if the cases were etched in memory. Brad Cutler faced 3 internal disciplinary hearings, he said, one for violence against a black suspect, one for abuse toward a colleague, and one for arbitrary stops. None were made public. All were handled internally. I requested disclosure to warn young officers, but was denied. The courtroom was silent. Jurors exchanged looks, some frowned, others took notes urgently. Ronald added, "If these reports were public, many incidents could have been prevented. But Brad had protection, and with that, records mean nothing." Meanwhile, social media erupted with the hashtag #SystemProtectedBrad, symbolizing a system shielding wrongdoers and silencing victims. Posts highlighted the cover-up behind Brad's actions, sparking widespread calls for accountability and independent oversight. The press dug deeper, revealing that many internal resolutions lacked transparency, eroding public trust. Brad remained silent in the courtroom, shoulders trembling slightly. He could no longer deny the growing image painted by testimonies and public outcry, not just as a shooter, but as a product of a flawed system that protects arrogance and prejudice. As the jury took notes, justice expanded beyond the courtroom to the voices and keyboards of those once silenced. Brad Cutler's name now stood for a system demanding root reform. The 15th day of the trial opened with a live television broadcast, where the host read aloud a number that startled the entire nation. More than 50,000 people had signed a petition calling for the dismissal of Police Chief Harlan Price for covering up and manipulating information related to Brad Cutler's shooting of Kenya Mallory. The petition began with a group of law students, but within 48 hours it spread nationwide thanks to the shocking videos and testimonies presented earlier. Harlan Price's name appeared repeatedly on social media forums, accompanied by a slew of leaked internal documents showing he had directly approved placing Brad on paid administrative leave the very night of the shooting. It was not just the number, but the speed of the spread that forced state officials to hold an emergency meeting. A city council communications advisor admitted in a report, "We are not facing an isolated incident, but a chain reaction of years of pent-up frustration." Citizens protested in front of the police headquarters, holding signs filled with unanswered questions. Who allowed Brad to keep patrolling? Who erased his disciplinary record? Who stands behind each whitewashing decision? That morning, in the state legislature chamber, a veteran senator rose to speak. He was Robert Claiborne, who had previously addressed the Senate on racial discrimination in law enforcement. Today, his voice was deeper, each word carrying the cold weight of a truth long neglected. "We are witnessing not an isolated case," he said, "but a summary of 400 years of repeating history." He paused before emphasizing, "That woman was shot in broad daylight. She is an agent of a federal agency." But what made the officer pull the trigger was not the badge information, but the color of the skin behind the wheel. And when we allow someone like Brad Cutler to continue wearing a uniform, it is not because we don't know, but because we are used to letting those records disappear. Below, many younger legislators bowed their heads, taking notes, while the press was ready with headlines. Claiborne's speech was quoted nearly verbatim across national newspapers, not only because of its powerful words, but because it perfectly matched the rising emotions of the people. They no longer believed this was just a matter of individual accountability. They saw a whole complicit machine, from command levels to political rank. News agencies began calling the case a flashpoint for a new generation. Analysts argued that no other case had sustained such massive public attention for 3 weeks. The people did not look away or abandon the story midway, for they no longer saw it as Kenya's alone, but as that of millions whose voices were never heard. Among the petition signers to remove the police chief were even some who had once voted for him. Harlan Price had yet to issue an official statement, but his office was surrounded. Automated email replies cut off, and press conferences indefinitely postponed. Meanwhile, at the courthouse, jurors were instructed to avoid media contact, but they could not ignore the banners lining the streets. 400 years cannot end with an apology, and every step Kenya took, every testimony, every clip played was a reminder that this time, history must change course. In a suburban Atlanta high school, Malik Johnson, an 11th grader, sat before a computer screen, eyes fixed on every frame. He was neither a director nor trained in film editing, but after watching the video of Kenya Mallory being shot, he couldn't sleep. Instead of remaining silent, he opened free animation software and meticulously recreated that morning. A silver sedan stopping, a black woman in an orange vest stepping out, calm eyes refusing to look away. Then an angry officer approached, his hand slowly sliding to his holster. The scene ended with a shot, no blood, no dialogue, just the words, "What is resistance if we never get to speak?" The video was posted under Malik's real name. Within 12 hours, views surpassed 1 million. After 3 days, it reached 10 million, with hundreds of thousands of shares and comments worldwide, praising the subtle yet painful message Malik conveyed visually. Celebrities shared it. Teachers invited him to discussions, and major newspapers sought interviews. And when asked why he made the video, Malik replied, "I don't know, Kenya, but I know the look of someone who isn't allowed to explain." That phrase spread in hundreds of posts, becoming a rallying message for those seeking to transform anger into concrete evidence that stays in viewers' minds. Meanwhile, independent journalist Elise Franco released a series of internal documents gathered over 2 years. The files revealed Brad Cutler's involvement in at least 4 other shootings without prosecution. Elise offered no personal opinion or inflammatory language, only reports, testimonies, crime scene photos, and clear timelines. In all cases, victims were unarmed people of color. The incidents were logged internally and then buried. Elise's 8,000-word report quickly became a key resource for civil investigators and watchdog groups. She was neither famous nor part of the system, but her tightly verified, detail-rich writing was hard to refute. Even major networks had to cite her work, despite previously dismissing her as an outsider. Facing anonymous threats, Elise continued releasing documents daily, not for scandal, but to ensure hidden truths wouldn't stay locked away. Her presence, alongside Malik's video, showed that truth lies not only in testimony or juries, but in the persistence of those indirectly involved who refuse to stand aside. Together, a teenage student not yet of voting age and a journalist without a newsroom did what many systems could not: create undeniable living evidence, quiet yet clear, forcing society to confront itself. Though unmentioned in court records, Malik and Elise stood as silent witnesses whose weight no one could ignore. On a Monday morning, right after the state legislature speeches were broadcast nationwide, the Federal Bureau of Investigation officially announced a comprehensive federal investigation into the entire patrol team's operations in the area where Brad Cutler had served. This decision did not come from media pressure, but from a series of documents and testimonies directly delivered by senior FBI agents to headquarters in Washington, revealing suspiciously repeated cases involving racially motivated violence in the same area over the past 4 years. The investigation targeted not only Brad, but also his direct commanders, who had approved dozens of vague incident reports and many body cam videos that conveniently malfunctioned at critical moments. Investigators were dispatched from 3 different states, independent of local ties, to ensure impartiality. A list of nearly 30 names was prepared for internal questioning. Among them, at least 8 were Brad's former teammates who were present during the controversial arrest. Particularly, all previously closed cases were ordered reopened to check for signs of fraud, forged reports, or manipulated conclusions. That same day, Kenya's legal team unexpectedly revealed new evidence at a short press conference outside the federal court. It was an audio recording made 10 months earlier during an informal training session Brad led for recruits. His voice was clear in the recording. "If you want to teach someone a lesson, shoot them in the stomach, not the head." The statement stunned the room into silence and caused reporters to revisit all cases involving Brad, each victim who had been shot in the abdomen or lower body. Kenya's lead attorney, Lydia Cho, presented the audio as proof that Brad's actions were not spontaneous but premeditated, even demonstrating a clear strategy of intimidation. She did not raise her voice or pound the table. When the recording ended, she said only one sentence: "This is not an individual error. This is a silent curriculum taught in the heart of America." The release of the audio set off a wave of reactions in legal and political circles. Federal lawmakers demanded hearings to investigate whether similar attitudes persisted across other law enforcement agencies. The Department of Justice considered elevating the case to federal prosecution if systemic criminal conduct was confirmed. Meanwhile, the police chief remained silent, with no one defending Brad or disputing the recording. Close associates distanced themselves, and former officers submitted anonymous statements, fearing retaliation for revealing internal misconduct. Though under a minute, the recording marked a turning point, revealing Brad's view of shooting as psychological control rather than self-defense. With the FBI now fully engaged, the notion of an accident was no longer tenable. The court ordered a forensic analysis of the audio, comparing Brad's voice from patrol videos, training recordings, and testimony. After 36 hours, experts confirmed the voice matched perfectly, eliminating any doubt. When the results were announced, the courtroom fell silent. Brad lowered his head, hands clenched, while his lawyer remained impassive. The prosecution said nothing further, eyes on the jury, some of whom took detailed notes. This voice verification shifted the narrative from a technical matter to proof of calculated intent sustained over time. That afternoon, a fifth witness, Marcus Fields, stepped forward. A black man in his 40s, previously arrested by Brad for non-cooperation. Marcus had stayed silent until inspired by viral videos and audio. Calmly, he recounted how Brad threatened him at an accident scene, ordering him to lie down or face force. His testimony aligned with undisclosed radio transmissions revealing Brad's intent to use force systematically. Marcus's account intensified pressure on the defense and made the jury grasp that this was more than an isolated shooting. Some jurors exchanged concerned looks, while Kenya sat quietly, her gaze steady. Piece by piece, the stories converged, exposing Brad not as a lone mistake, but as a product of a corrupt system now laid bare. When the judge entered the courtroom, silence fell instantly, as if all sound was cut off. Those standing in the back no longer whispered, as in previous sessions. The press set down their recorders, and the jury sat ready, their faces revealing they knew the forthcoming verdict would leave an indelible mark on the justice system. The judge wasted no time. His voice was steady, cold and clear. Bradley James Cutler is sentenced to 35 years in federal prison, no parole, no pardon, for intentionally causing grievous bodily harm to a federal officer in the line of duty. Court adjourned. The room remained frozen. Some seated near Kenya's family bowed their heads quietly, while her mother clasped her daughter's hand in the wheelchair, nodding softly as if to say, "It's over now." Brad sat motionless from the moment his name was called, head bowed, eyes staring into nothingness. His face showed no emotion, no plea. When the judge uttered the last word, Brad clenched the chair's edge tightly, as if holding something inside from shattering. Veins stood out on his hand, yet he did not move. At that moment, nothing more needed to be said. A court officer placed a hand on his shoulder, signaling it was time to stand. Brad rose slowly, head still lowered, hands reaching behind as a familiar reflex rather than a command. The metal cuffs clicked shut with a light yet resounding sound. Kenya remained still in her wheelchair as the judge's final gavel strike echoed in the room. Her face showed no change, only her eyes briefly closing as if replaying all the sounds from the past days. The morning sirens, harsh commands, the trigger pull, then her gasping breath in the blood on the pavement. Everything came crashing down, not loud, but heavy. She closed her eyes, fingers tightening into a loose fist on her lap. Then she breathed deeply, not hurried, not suppressed, but as a survivor needs to keep from collapsing again. "I don't need victory. I need people to see the truth," Kenya said slowly, her voice low and clear. No one dared interrupt. Her words stripped away the legal veneer surrounding the case. All debates, charts, evidence, and sharp rebuttals fell silent before what seemed a simple truth. She came not to claim glory, not to receive medals or praise. She came so the world could witness one thing, that in moments when no one seems to be watching, the truth remains, and it hurts to the core. The courtroom could not hold back the silence. It burst into a wave of sound, not cheers, but an explosion of long-suppressed emotion. People applauded, some wept. Reporters hurriedly rewrote their headlines, changing conviction to symbol. A major newspaper called the trial the precedent of the century, not only for Brad Cutler's sentence, but because for the first time, an allegedly untouchable system paused to confront itself. Editorials appeared that very afternoon with bold headlines on the front page. Not everyone is police, but everyone has the right to live without being shot. Radio broadcasts replayed Kenya's words as a historic quote, Television debates offered hundreds of legal, political, and social analyses, but all focused on one core question: is this verdict enough to stop the next bullet? Can the testimony of a wounded federal agent open doors for hundreds of similar cases never properly addressed? That case presents clearly on campuses and school buses and yachts. Among those leaving the courthouse that day were mothers who had lost children, those dragged onto sidewalks for their skin color, and public officials who had remained silent before wrongful colleagues. They barely met eyes but shared an invisible bond, a silent promise that from now on they would not let this story fade like hundreds of names lost in internal files. Kenya did not look back. She was wheeled out through a side exit, away from cameras and debates. The sky that day was clear, the sun soft enough to reveal her eyes when they opened, brighter than the day she lay in intensive care, caught between life and death. She knew, though the sentence had been delivered, the journey was far from over. But at least one chapter in the long story of injustice had an answer, and this time it came from truth itself, not from anyone else. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered in 3 rings where Brad would be led away. Live television was set up 10 meters away. Reporters were ordered to keep their distance. An elderly woman wept, shading her eyes, whispering she had waited 10 years to see a cop truly sentenced for shooting an unarmed person. A boy beside her asked, "Does she still hurt?" She only nodded. Minutes later, Kenya was wheeled out. She wore a dark suit, hair tied back, her abdominal wound covered by a buttoned jacket. Her face showed no triumph, no joy. It was the gaze of someone who carried a bullet for the rest of her life, knowing justice would never erase the memory. She did not look at Brad. She looked up to the sky, letting the light touch her forehead, then turned to her mother, holding her hand. They quietly left the frame. As for Brad, the man who once believed he was the law, discipline, the keeper of order, he was led through the cold stone corridor where no cameras, no microphones, no voices defended him. With 35 years in federal prison ahead, he knew his life had no turning back. This was a sentence for his actions and a declaration to those who thought the badge on their chest could replace morality. The federal investigation didn't stop with Brad Cutler. Just 1 week after the trial, special inspectors entered the local police headquarters with a full audit order. Every record, from minor violations to armed shootings over the past 10 years, was demanded within 24 hours. Officers who once sat silently while Brad uttered racial slurs, who laughed as he threatened black residents with handcuffs, were now suspended. 12 people, from patrol officers to mid-level commanders, were temporarily removed for lack of supervision and systematic cover-ups. One of them was the officer who whispered to Brad after the shooting, "Wrap this up fast. Don't let her name leak." The collapse was no longer a headline theory. Residents outside the precinct saw nameplates taken down, officers leaving with heads bowed. Many victims of discrimination quietly filed complaints, now believing someone would listen. A man who lost 2 front teeth for not stopping on the white line tearfully said he finally had a voice in a country that had ignored him too long. The Department of Justice acted before the final report, issuing an urgent nationwide directive to review civilian patrol procedures. Key points emphasized included reevaluating ethics standards, expanding independent oversight, and mandatory training on civil rights and unbiased emergency response. It was the first federal order in nearly 30 years aiming to overhaul local police patrols. An executive committee member told TV, "This is a necessary reaction. Without reform, this system will deepen divisions." Some states resisted, but many launched retraining programs. Civil rights courses appeared in police academies, new materials were rushed to rural counties, several veteran commanders retired early, replaced by new leaders, mostly those who had long spoken out against internal discrimination, but were ignored. Kenya Mallory's name, though silent on TV since the trial, became emblematic in presentations, closed-door meetings, and academy training boards. Agent Mallory's case and the system's lesson. What was once ignored became mandatory. Calls once transferred became standard. Those who stood behind the trigger faced the light they thought would never reach them. The reforms couldn't erase the fired bullet, but forced a nation to admit could no longer pay for trust with blood. 6 months after the historic trial, the Illinois Police Academy launched mandatory training named Kenya. The curriculum opened with a bold line on a white page. Not everyone can stand still when a gun is pointed, but Kenya Mallory stood tall. The course focused on 3 pillars: civilian rights during patrols, nonviolent control psychology, and a detailed case study of Kenya and Brad. Real footage played in class, every glance, command, and action paused for legal and ethical analysis. They neither glorified the victim nor spun an inspiring tale, preserving the truth. A woman unarmed, shot in the abdomen on the street by an officer, taught quick reaction to survive. The Kenya program spread nationwide. Many academies added it to their curriculum. Young officers said in interviews that they learned for the first time about power paired with limits, watching behavior without bias, and training for multi-ethnic scenarios rather than emotion. Kenya was no longer a name, it was a red line, an unbreakable threshold in the profession. When the federal government proposed awarding her the Citizen's Honor Medal, Kenya declined. The ceremony was set for Washington, with the Attorney General and the FBI present. The invitation cited her resilience as sparking unprecedented reform. She read the letter from her hospital room, expression unchanged. The next day, she appeared before the media in a dark shirt, calm and resolute, saying, "I don't need symbols, I need real change." Her words led the evening news. Some questioned why she refused national honor, but most understood. For Kenya, titles after the ordeal felt like medals of apology. She did not want her story framed and forgotten behind glass. She wanted it to compel systemic change, from how officers approach citizens to empowering independent investigations. Asked why she rejected praise, she answered simply, "Because I'm still alive." It wasn't pride, it was a reminder. Brad thought she wouldn't survive. Once said in the dark by a broken phone and bottle, "Don't let her live." But Kenya was here. She faced the court, looked at the man who pulled the trigger, and now used her name to warn those in uniform. A bullet can end a life, but it cannot bury the consequences if the survivor still stands, looking at society and saying, "This is the line. I won't let anyone cross it again." The afternoon wind softly swept through the low rooftops along the old street, carrying warmth and the vague aftershocks of a place once forgotten on the map of justice. Kenya Mallory walked slowly, unescorted, with no patrol car or press barriers, just a woman in simple clothes returning to the spot where the blood from her body had soaked the rough pavement less than a year ago. There, new traffic signs stood, a surveillance camera reinstalled higher up, and the street light replaced by a brighter, cleaner model. But technical changes could not erase human memory. No markers were hung, yet each paving stone beneath her feet seemed to speak. Kenya paused mid-street, sunlight tracing a bright path over her short-cut hair, her gaze following the balconies above. There, a witness once recorded video that helped expose a deliberate lie disguised as a trained reflex. She did not come for nostalgia. She only wanted to feel alive again after a day that should have been the end. On the sidewalk, a group of children played. Bikes leaned askew, tiny sneakers dusted with sand, laughter ringing out, sharply separated from the air once filled with sirens and the scent of blood that year. A boy of about 9 suddenly stopped. He stared at her for a long time, his round eyes flickering with hesitation and curiosity. He neither ran up nor showed fear. It was a genuine look from a child raised amid stories adults called news, but children knew as everyday life. He timidly asked, uncertain because he only heard about it on TV, "Are you the one who got shot, right?" Kenya did not answer immediately. She studied him briefly, as if ensuring those eyes held no pity. Then she smiled softly and nodded. "Yes. But now I'm standing, and you will too." That was not consolation. It was a seed planted firmly in a mind ready to grow amid chaos. The boy bent down, picked up a plastic item someone dropped, a small badge, a toy edged in pale blue, with faint letters, "Junior Police." He held it up to show her, as if affirming his sincere words, "I'm going to be a police officer, like you." Kenya took it, examined it in her hand, cheap plastic, but for that boy it was a promise of the future. She did not ask why. No need to know if he truly understood the police profession or just wanted to stand against people like Bra. who still wore the badge, as he once did. She looked at the boy and gently said, "Then you need to remember one thing. The badge is what people see, but character is what they feel. You have to choose which is truly yours." The boy nodded, clutching the plastic badge tightly. A call echoed from the street's end, probably his mother. He ran off, not forgetting to look back once more. Kenya stood there, still not leaving the spot once soaked with blood beneath her jacket. The wind rose again, not cold but enough to flap the edge of her coat lightly against her body. She turned, never looking back. All she needed to see she had seen. On the way home, her phone vibrated twice. A message from an old colleague. "There's a statewide internal misconduct policy meeting tomorrow morning. You should be there." The second was an email report from the investigative team about other units previously accused of misconduct similar to Brad's. She did not smile or react, only held the screen to mark it as read. Inside the car, late-day sunlight streamed through the window, reflecting off a faded scar on her left wrist. The bullet wound left consequences far deeper than physical ones, but it did not stop a person from returning to a place where she once knelt under prejudice to prove that no one could keep her down forever. Not once again, and certainly not in front of children, looking to the future with eyes both confused and resolute, like the boy today. Under dim newsroom light, a report over 200 pages was laid before federal advisors. The bold headline read, "Report on racially motivated shootings in the past 12 months, rate over 60%. Data from across states was compiled into evidence, no longer opinion. Each case and victim revealed a system turning anger into legalized violence." Kenya Mallory was among them, not the last name but a turning point, challenging endless under-investigation reports with no answers. The Justice Department called for reform in over 30 patrol districts, stating, "Citizen survival cannot depend on biased instincts of uniformed individuals." At a small screening, white text slowly appeared on a black screen. She survived, but how many did not? The question stirred unease, reminding all that one survivor does not mean a cleansed system. Next, a faded FBI logo dissolved into darkness, replaced by Kenya, standing tall, hand on her wound not to show pain, but to claim control. Behind her, hundreds stood silently, eyes no longer forgiving, demanding accountability without anger or tears. Kenya spoke no words in the final frame. Her standing was a declaration, a life pushed to despair, yet choosing to face forward. The screen faded, lights rose, no applause, only quiet reflection. The final question lingered. How many others never had this chance? Her story was a chain of decades-long injustice, from sirens behind her to the bullet piercing her. Kenya survived to tell the truth, not to lament, but to prove silence saves no one. Brad Cutler symbolized power wielded by anger and domination, but faced a resolute federal agent refusing to submit. His trigger pull was met with a changed world. Witnesses, videos, live streams, and millions ensuring truth could not be buried. Kenya did not yell hatred, but stood in court, calm and firm. She demands the truth, breaking the silence forever. Brad's sentence, 35 years, no parole, sent a clear message. Kenya's victory was a real change in facing abuse of power. Her lesson, justice must be demanded. Survival is the start of responsibility. One who stands tall at the edge can force the system to confront itself. Kenya did this not for praise, but so no one else suffers as she did. Justice begins with courage, not to bow. Thank you for following this story to its very last moment. Kenya Mallory is not a symbol built from admiration, but a living testament to what happens when an ordinary person chooses not to bow down. Amid stray bullets, false excuses, and a seemingly untouchable system, she stood tall, both in body and in truth. And if you ever doubted that a single person can move justice, this story is your answer. So, if anyone asks, what can one person do? Tell them about Kenya. Then stand up, because truth needs a voice, justice needs courage, and change needs to begin with you.